The greatest thing happened this week, and it happens, well, it's happened for 14 or 15 years, just right around this time of year. I got a text from my son-in-law in Singapore who said, "Here are the flight details for our visit this Christmas." And the first thing I thought about was sitting at the dining room table and talking and talking and talking. So many things have happened around that table. So many special times. Special food, of course. Katharina, whenever I got the text, she got her notebook out and started writing a grocery list for Sarah's favorite foods. You know that? So many witty things said around that table. You know the class clown of a son that we have? And that, well, you kind of know the experience, I suspect. So many important things have happened around that table. So many significant announcements made. So many decisions slowly or maybe even quickly taken. So many memorable things around those meal tables. And as we talk as a family, as we talk with visitors, and we're so glad when that happens too, as we talk together around that table, you can just sense the intimacy growing, the importance of the conversation taking root in people's hearts and making a difference. I know that's what happens in my heart anyway. And I'm drawn closer to the ones around the table. And that's the kind of setting that we have for this paragraph that we listened to just a few minutes ago from John chapter 15. They're sitting around the table, Jesus and his disciples. It's a holiday time, a Passover meal, the big celebration in Israel's life, in the people of God's life, because it looked back to the time when God had rescued people from the nation, from slavery in Egypt, and brought them with a strong, outstretched arm and left the Egyptians in the dust. And as they sat around the table that night for they didn't realize it at the time, but for one last supper with Jesus before he died, you could just sense the important things being said and the intimacy of that gathering drawing people together and making a difference in their lives. As they sit around the supper table that evening, the Lord Jesus says, "Remain in my love." By that he means, when I'm gone, don't forget the close bonds that we've forged and the intimacy we've shared. Although they couldn't know it at the time, what he meant by remain in my love was, it's all going to go south from here and it's going to look like a horrible defeat. When I'm hung on that cross tomorrow morning, he didn't say those things. And it would be important for them to remember that they were to remain in his love, that they were to keep on being loyal to him, that they were to keep the faith and maintain the intimacy of knowing and trusting Jesus, who showed them the Father and gave them the Spirit. Don't forget the close bonds that we've forged and the intimacy we've shared, and remain in my love. And be inspired, he says, by not just the bond that we have with each other, but with the bond that I have, Jesus says, with the Father. be inspired by the communion and the fellowship that the Father and the Son, that God in heaven and God on earth have with each other. Remain in my love, he says, just as I have remained in my Father's love. And don't let your life from here on become kind of protective and self-centered and kind of huddled in a corner. Express the love that you feel for each other and that you know that you have from God just as I have from God, Jesus says. Express the love for those around you at church and home and beyond. Instead of withdrawing into a holy huddle or restricting your love to just a chosen few, love each other, Jesus says, as I have loved you. And although they couldn't realize the profound depths of his love on the Thursday night, by Friday and Saturday, and especially on Sunday, they knew for sure Jesus was for them with an enthusiasm and a power that was unrivaled. So as you can see, as you keep on tracking through this paragraph, this kind of practical regard for others, this kind of love that Jesus talks about, is based on true friendship. Friendship with God, friendship with our common friend, Jesus Christ, and friendship with each other here at West End and wider all through the church and, in fact, all through the centuries. I've called you friends, Jesus says to them at that Last Supper. I've called you friends, Jesus says to you and me today. And like a true friend, he tells them, I haven't held anything back. Everything I learned from my Father, I've made known to you. And then he says it again, love one another. So I don't think it's too surprising that at the Last Supper that Jesus had with his followers, when they were gathered around the table and the intimacy that they had experienced and that had grown together over the years had kind of focused on one particular spot, one place in an upper room in Jerusalem. It wasn't any surprise that they would be talking, that Jesus especially would be talking about love and friendship. What is surprising is the way the conversation takes a bit of a turn in the middle. I've left out those parts so far. In verse 13, he says, greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. Where did that come from? We've read the words so often that they don't shock us the way they shock them. But in the middle of all this love and friendship discussion, in the center of this intimacy that had grown over the years, Jesus talks about losing our lives for others. Laying down one's life for another, for a friend. There's no greater love, he says, than to lay down one's life for one's friends. As the Message so bluntly translates it, this is the very best way to love. Put your life on the line for your friends. Well, it was a startling thing to hear, of course, and it was something that Jesus would bring up over and over again. If you read these chapters 14 to 16 in John, if you look in other places in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and 1 Corinthians that tell about that Last Supper, you'll hear over and over again the echoes of imminent death. This bread, he said, and surprised them again, represents my body torn in two for you. This blood, this wine, he said, this cup means my blood poured out on the ground for you. And so many kind of religious sorts of things said, and then these horrible things mixed into the middle of them. There's no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends. Self-sacrifice is a very high standard of loving. Jesus says that himself. There's no greater love than this. But because we love Jesus, because it's Christ who directs us, we take that command seriously. Because we've had a chance, many of us, to grow in this faith and knowledge of God, this faith in Jesus, this knowledge of God, this fellowship of the Holy Spirit, because we've had a chance to be drawn into the inner circle of Jesus' followers, because we've sat around the table, and whether it be here or there or at home or wherever, because we've had a chance to grow in intimacy, in knowing Jesus Christ, we take it seriously when he says, there's no greater love than this. Because it's Jesus who tells us, we take this command seriously. Occasionally you hear examples of this, don't you? You turn on the news and discover some remarkable act of heroism. I heard about a man who had a seizure once, and he fell onto the tracks of the New York subway. And he was rescued by a man who jumped down and pushed the younger man into a drainage ditch between the tracks and covered him with his body while the train rushed by just a few centimeters above them. I remember hearing a story, too, more recently about an accident on the 102 where the car burst into flames and someone, the first person who stopped, wrenched open the door and pulled the unconscious man from the flames, and he lived. Far more frequent, of course, are the smaller sacrifices that are the training ground for these kind of life and death decisions. A musician who chooses the smaller Christian market. Colleagues who give credit to each other instead of preening before their boss. A friend who listens to someone talk about their difficulties without interrupting or changing the subject. Parents who refuse to sacrifice their family life on the altar of career. Children caring for an aging parent. Those sacrifices are significant. Those sacrifices are like giving your life one evening at a time, one sleepless night after another. And they're the training ground, as I say, for the life or death occasions when you and I might be called to even greater love in Jesus' terms. Sometimes, as you know today, as we've been focusing on this, sometimes the sacrifices are on a larger scale, sometimes taken to an horrific extent. Such is the case with World War I. Just 100 years in the past, now we can say that. The worldwide death toll was nearly 17 million people. Canada's population at the time was 8 million, and more than 600,000 people from Canada served in the Great War. Think of that in terms of percentages. What a tremendous, large proportion of Canadians that is. More than 66,000 people died. That number came home to me recently when I was at the bookstore and saw this magazine, a commemorative First World War centennial edition of Maclean's. Perhaps some of you have seen it already. And on the front it says, this issue is dedicated to Private John Webb. Died August the 15th, 1917, 19 years old. And I thought, what's that about? And I picked it off the shelf, and I saw the next one on the shelf, and it was also dedicated to somebody named Webb. And I thought, oh, they've just dedicated them all to Private John Webb. But no, the next one on the shelf is Private John G. Webb from somewhere else, who died on a different day at a different age. And there were 8 or 10 copies on the shelf, and so I picked them all up and I looked through them, and they're all dedicated to a particular person. And down at the bottom in the small print it says, this is one of 66,349 unique editions of this magazine, each bearing the name of a Canadian serviceman or woman who died in the Great War plus 1 for the unknown soldier. 66,349. I poked around the internet after that, fascinated by numbers for a bit, and I started to wonder about civilian casualties as well as wartime service deaths. And of course, when you look up the numbers and break them down by country, you discover that all kinds of countries who were within the path of that Second World War events suffered hundreds and hundreds of thousands. Some, more than 1 million people, civilians from a particular country, died in World War I looked up Canada in the list. Did we lose civilians in that war? Yes, it said. 2,000 of them. All of them in Halifax. Because the Halifax explosion, between what was Halifax and Dartmouth at the time, took 2,000 lives. Collateral damage of the war effort. And just think then of the percentages of people in Halifax who were affected by that war, deaths in that war. Here at West End, about 70 men and women served overseas. There's 100 names, as I mentioned, over there. Not quite sure the reasons for the difference. The plaque is not, seems to be a World War I plaque, but perhaps other names have been added since and the roll call revised, I'm not sure. But nevertheless, that's 70 people, 100 people whose names we know. Although I asked around a little bit in this past week about these names, I didn't have a chance to connect with somebody who knew somebody, but I'm sure there are people here who know some of those people, or heard of them at least, or knew their relatives. And 10 who paid the ultimate price. I looked up one of them. I looked up several of them actually on the internet. There's databases where you can type people's names in and see some of the things they did. I didn't have enough time to sort it out in detail, but I discovered that one of them was Air Mechanic 3rd Class Louis David Loy, L.D. Loy. Died the 19th of October, 1918. 3 weeks before the armistice. Buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in Dartmouth. And I thought, my dad was an air mechanic in the Second World War. We are all in a web of dependency, of people connected to people, people who know people, people today who remember others and honor the great love that would lay down one's life for one's friends. Those who died in that great war were sacrificing their lives for us, placing their bodies in danger so that our lives could continue. And although everybody's motives are mixed, including mine and yours, those self-sacrificial actions were made because of kinship with us and out of concern for those back home and out of a determination that the political order would be turned back to one that respected life and freedom. Out of love, they laid down their lives for friends and fellow citizens. Such love. And now I'm stepping back and looking more broadly. Such love, as the kind that we've been talking about today, such love is often inspired and powered by Jesus, who laid down his life for his friends. Even though Jesus was the victim of others who conspired against him, he nevertheless deliberately put himself in harm's way. He offered his life for others, and he made that explicit in his teaching about it beforehand. We hear it from his own lips when he says, I am the good shepherd, and I lay down my life for my sheep. John, the disciple, reiterates the point in his first letter. This is how we know what love is, he says. These are the distinguishing characteristics of love. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. Love's defining moment was the cross of Jesus Christ. It was there that we saw unparalleled love and devotion. It was there that the intimacy that had developed around the table, that had been gathering up until that time, it was there that the determination that Jesus had to fulfill the will of his Father and die on the cross for sinners, it was there that that love came to completion. It's there that we see the ultimate example of love. And it's there with that example that we're inspired to love others, to obey Jesus' command when he says, love each other. Even when it's difficult, keep on loving. Remain in my love, he says, and love each other. But here's the last word about this today. This love that Jesus had for us on the cross is not just an example. It's a wonderful accomplishment. It's an event, a one-off event that changed the course of history. It wasn't just a time when we saw the ultimate example of love. It was a time when the ultimate example of love made a difference in the world's life, in our life, in your life. It was a time when Jesus sacrificed his own existence, put his own life on the line, in fulfillment of all the preparation and the prophecies and the sacrifices that had gone before. Jesus fulfilled all of those. And then they needed never to be done again, as Jesus laid down his life for his friends. When he said those words, greater love has no one than this. When he said those words, his death was just hours away. He knew that his time was drawing near and that the full resources of his love would be needed to go through with it. We see him praying after this in the Garden of Gethsemane, agonizing tears of blood as he wrestles with whether he's going to go through and do what needs to be done. He saw the horror of it all, not simply the horror of dying. Many people have faced death unafraid. But he saw the horror, the awful terribleness of bearing my sins, your sins, the world's sins. He saw what incredible hurt it would be to have his soul torn apart by the death of his enemies. But having loved his own who were in the world, he was determined to show them the full extent of his love. That's the sacrifice to leave here with this morning. That's the sacrifice to remember on this Remembrance Day, even on this round-numbered Remembrance Day. The sacrifice of Jesus. The intimate love of Christ that had your name written into the sentence. Greater love has no one than this, than one lay down one's life for one's friends. Praise Jesus.